Welcome to everybody from around the world to this unusual and wonderful seminar. I am just delighted to be able to moderate today's discussion and first to introduce our two speakers, William J. Perry and Tom Kalina. Many of you know Bill Perry. He is chair of the Bulletin's Board of Sponsors. He served as the U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering in the Carter administration, and then, as many of you know, was Secretary of Defense in the Clinton administration. Bill Perry's memoir of 2015, My Journey at the Nuclear Brink, is a personal account of his lifelong effort to reduce nuclear dangers. He also has founded the William J. Perry Project to educate the public about these dangers. And of course, in 2020, he has co-authored The Button, The New Nuclear Arms Race and Presidential Power from Truman to Trump, with Tom Kalina, who's here with us today as well. Bill is also the Michael and Barbara Berberian Professor Emeritus at Stanford University, and he's zooming in from that part of the world today. Tom Kalina, I have known for several years. I was on the board of the Plowshares Fund, where Tom serves as Director of Policy. He has also been the Research Director at the Arms Control Association and the Director of the Global Security Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. He's got 30 years of experience working on nuclear weapons issues and is a truly tireless advocate for reducing nuclear dangers. So today we are very, very pleased to have the two of them here to talk about their new book, The Button, here it is, which is really about the nuclear dangers that we face today. It is a kind of citizen's guide, but even more than that, it's an elegant and powerful case for reducing nuclear weapons launch readiness and the dangers that it presents. It's based on their observation that the US is focusing on the wrong threat. The real threat comes not from a surprise attack from Russia or some other country, but from misperception, miscalculation, or madness that would take us into blunder, into a nuclear war. The solution to this problem requires, they think, addressing three key parts of US nuclear policy that they'll talk about in detail today: the president's sole authority to launch nuclear weapons, the United States policy that we will use nuclear weapons first, even against a non-nuclear threat, and from our very intercontinental intercontinental ballistic missile force with dozens of nuclear weapons on them. We'll start with Tom, who will take us through the argument, and then we'll begin questions and discussion. So Tom, off to you.
Kenneth, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks also to Hallie and to Rachel and to the Bulletin, the Atomic Scientists, for hosting this event. Looking forward to it. I'm going to share my screen now, so let's hope this works. How does that look?
Great.
Yeah? Excellent. Let's be thankful for small miracles. So as Kenneth said, I'm policy director at the Plowshares Fund, and I had the honor of writing this book with Bill Perry, which was published just last month. And we did that to take advantage of some key anniversaries. Of course, this week, July 16th, marks the 75th anniversary of the first nuclear test, the Trinity test in New Mexico. And then, of course, in August, we'll have the 75th anniversary of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. And then this November, we'll choose our next president. And these events, to us, create a historic opportunity to debate the future of US nuclear policy. We have lived with the bomb now for 75 years. And so it's time to ask, what should the next president do to reduce the risk of nuclear war? So there's a shot, the only color photo of the Trinity test 75 years ago on Thursday. And as we assess the bomb at 75, we have to ask this question: has the bomb made us safer? And our answer to that is a clear no, it is not. And that we'd be safer in a world without nuclear weapons today. And as we look at the last 75 years and all of the efforts that have been tried to limit and eliminate the bomb, of course, the bomb is still with us. And so we should look at what lessons we can learn from that. The first one is that the bomb is resilient. It survived the end of the Cold War. It survived the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in fact, is making a comeback, as we'll talk more about. The bomb is now largely invisible. Most Americans have long forgotten mushroom clouds, fallout shelters, and duck and cover. And so this raises the third lesson for me, which is the dangers posed by the bomb have not gone away, and in fact have gotten worse the longer they're left unaddressed. But there is also hope. The current national crisis, the collapsing economy, the resurgent coronavirus, racial injustice that has been exposed by all of this, but of course has been with us for generations, creates important opportunities for change. And the coronavirus itself shows us that US leaders have been focused on the wrong threats. We're spending way too much on outdated Cold War scenarios and not enough on the key threats we face today. And despite having a $700+ billion defense budget, many Americans simply do not feel safe. Take, for example, the $2 trillion the United States plans to spend on nuclear weapons over the next 3 decades. Much of this is simply not needed, and we should see this as a nuclear piggy bank, if you will, that the next president could break open to pay for higher priority needs. But this is not all about money. We need to change policy too. The bomb has no role to play in addressing the most serious threats we face, and in fact, it can make those threats even worse. So let's unpack this a bit. We like to show this photo because it tends to focus the mind. Here's President Trump with the infamous football, the briefcase that contains everything the president needs to start nuclear war. This is literally how close we are to nuclear war every day, every minute, right now. President Trump can order an attack on his own authority, no second opinions, input from Congress or the Secretary of Defense is not required. We do not mean to single out President Trump in this way. Clearly his impulsiveness and disregard for the facts highlight these concerns, but all presidents make mistakes. All presidents are human. And so we strongly feel that no single human should control the future of humanity. So we, the American people, choose to give the president this absolute power. Why? Why do we choose to live so close to the brink of disaster? And as we conclude in the book, it's because US nuclear policy is focused on the wrong threat. So let's get into the argument we make in the book. So we make the central argument that US policy is focused on the wrong threat of a surprise attack from Russia. Such a policy is highly unlikely in our judgment for the simple reason that such an attack would mean the utter destruction of both sides. And yet US nuclear policy has been focused on this threat for decades. And here's the big problem with this. This mistaken threat assessment undermines US security by driving policies that increase the risk of blundering into nuclear war by mistake. We could start nuclear war in response to a false alarm, which is one of the greatest dangers in the world. And we just simply do not have to take this risk. Instead, we must move away from quick launch policies and give the president more decision time by limiting nuclear use to a second strike deterrence only mission. So Bill, bringing you into this, Bill had a front row seat on the arms race and met with Soviet and Russian leaders many times. Some might challenge our central assertion that a surprise attack from Russia is not a likely threat. Bill, what would you say to that?
Well, Tom, when I was Secretary of Defense, I met with hundreds of Russian leaders, from the President, Minister of Defense, Minister of Foreign Affairs. And before I was Secretary and after I was Secretary, I met with thousands of Russians, both in and out of government. And the one thing I can say with a lot of confidence is that the Russians are not stupid, and the Russians are not suicidal. They're not going to launch an attack on us, which would lead to their own suicide. So we focused on the wrong threat. A surprise attack, a bolt out of the blue, is not realistic. What is realistic, however, is we might blunder into a nuclear war.
Thank you. And the perceived threat of a surprise attack drives the military requirement that we must be ready to launch nuclear weapons at all times within minutes. And that in turn drives these three dangerous policies. If I can get this to work. First, that the president has sole authority to launch nuclear weapons within minutes with no second opinions or oversight. Second, that the president can order a first strike and is not limited to retaliation. And third, that the president can launch hundreds of land-based ballistic missiles, ICBMs, on warning of attack without waiting for proof of attack. And we spend quite a bit of time in the book outlining how dangerous these policies are, particularly in combination. And Bill, if you could give us a summary of that.
Well, we have to be seriously concerned about a false alarm. We have had 5 or 6 of them in history. They're not theoretical to me. In fact, I experienced personally 2 of those false alarms when I was Undersecretary of Defense during the Cold War. One of them occurred at 3 o'clock in the morning. I was woken with a phone call, and the voice on the other end of the line identified himself as the watch officer at the North American Air Defense Command. And the first thing he said to me was that his computer was showing 200 ICBMs on the way from the Soviet Union to the United States. I will never forget that moment. It's seared in my memory. He quickly went on to tell me that he had concluded his computers were in error. And why was he calling me? I was the technical person in the government at that time. Why was he calling me? Because he wanted me to see if I could help him figure out what had gone wrong with his computers. Well, it turned out it was a simple error because of a faulty chip in the computer. It was a mechanical problem. But other mistakes we've had have been as a result of human error. Humans are human, they do err. Machines do err. It's happened before and it can happen again.
Thank you. Let's expand on the dangers of sole authority. In 1963, President Kennedy warned that we could stumble into nuclear war due to, quote, accident or miscalculation or madness. Bill, can you help us understand how this might happen?
Well, first of all, the president may be getting bad information. And a classic example of that, of course, is in Cuba, when both Kennedy and Khrushchev were doing everything they could to avoid a war. But we almost blundered into a war over the Cuban Missile Crisis, really by bad information, bad mistake. One particular bad information was that the president did not know that the Soviet Union already had nuclear weapons ready to go in Cuba, not on the medium-range missiles, which were not yet ready and which we were watching, but on tactical missiles, which had nuclear weapons and where the operators had the authority to use them. So if President Kennedy had accepted the recommendation of his Joint Chiefs of Staff and conducted a military operation against Cuba, our troops would have been decimated on the beachhead with tactical nuclear weapons, and a general nuclear war would surely have followed. Beyond that, there's a problem of the unstable decider. We have today a president who is impulsive. We have before a president who was, and President Nixon, who in the last few months of his presidency was heavily under the influence of alcohol. And President Reagan, in his last few months of office, was beginning the early stages of Alzheimer's. And we can have a false alarm, which we've already discussed. That problem, which was bad enough when I was in office, has been made worse by the presence of cyber warfare. So the real problem is we might blunder into a nuclear war. And that should be driving US policy, not the concern of a deliberate surprise attack.
So let's talk about solutions. If I could get my, sorry. So the next president can and must reorient US nuclear policy away from a surprise attack to preventing nuclear war. And Bill, can you lay out the main arguments for how to do this?
Well, one action which would really improve our security would be if we would end sole authority. And at the moment, there's a legislation pending the Congress to do that. The Marquis Rubio, it's not likely to pass this year, but with the new Congress next year, it will be brought up again and it has a better chance of passing. We should establish a no first use policy in the United States. Make clear that our nuclear weapons are for the purpose of deterrence only. And again, there's legislation proposing to do that, the Warren-Smith bill, which again has no chance of passing this year, maybe next year. And finally, I believe we should phase out our ICBMs and build our deterrence forces only on our submarines and bombers. Our ICBMs, I believe, are accidents waiting to happen.
Thank you. So wrapping up our presentation here, nuclear weapons are the president's weapons, and every 4 years we have a chance to change US nuclear policy. And the 75th anniversary of the bomb and the current national crisis creates a rare opportunity, we think, to rethink our approach to national security. US nuclear policy is doing us more harm than good. Our nuclear arsenal magnifies the dangers we face for the most likely nuclear threat, blundering into nuclear war by mistake. And so the next president can and must fix this. We know this will be hard. We're up against 75 years of outdated thinking and a $50 billion industry. And history tells us that major change like this is only possible if led by the president with public support and therefore public pressure to deliver. So we are looking to educate the next president and the public like you. So thank you very much for your attention. And if you're interested in buying the book, you can go to benbellabooks.com and use the code button30 to get 30% off. And if you like the book, please rate us on amazon.com. Thank you very much. And I turn it back over to Kenneth.
Thanks very much, Tom, and to you, Secretary Perry, for a terrific presentation to start off the discussion. I would like to get to some of the lessons learned, and especially about the obstacles to policy changes that you call for. But first, I'd like to take a minute to look back over the last 75 years on this anniversary of the Trinity test, and just hear from you about some of the missed opportunities to reduce nuclear risk. You say we might have an opportunity now. We've had opportunities in the past, and I wonder if we could learn from those. I guess I'm thinking about two in particular. At the Reykjavik summit between Reagan and Gorbachev in 1986, both leaders said we would like to get rid of nuclear weapons, and there was a terrific opportunity at the end of the Cold War to do that, but we didn't. And I'd be interested to hear what you think went wrong. And so also with President Obama, who was initially very intent on bringing down the numbers of nuclear weapons, and in his Prague speech of 2009, called for peace and security of a world free from nuclear weapons. So what kept him from taking the major steps to fulfill that promise? Bill, maybe I could turn to you first to get your reflections on what some of those missed opportunities might have been in the past that we can learn from.
Well, briefly on the Reykjavik summit, we came very close to the two presidents agreeing to eliminate nuclear weapons. They would have had a very difficult time implementing that decision, but they were close to that decision. And what stopped it was that President Gorbachev wanted Reagan to agree to give up our ballistic missile program. And at the moment, Reagan has working on something which was called SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, sometimes nicknamed Star Wars. And he was unwilling to accept Gorbachev's view that it should be limited to laboratory work only. And on that basis, on that problem, they were not able to reach an agreement. So that was what caused the missed opportunity then. And ironically, that program which Reagan was defending died of its own weight a few years after that. But that was the hang up there. In the case of President Obama, he was a president who was fully aware of all the points we've talked about in our book, was anxious to actually greatly reduce and eventually eliminate nuclear weapons. And so I had high hopes that we were going to get major results then. He started off with a bang, which was the New START Treaty, but that bang quickly turned into a fizzle because he had a very difficult time getting this very simple treaty, very non-controversial, what I thought non-controversial treaty, ratified. And he finally was able to squeak it through by bringing it up in the recess session of the Senate. But he did that only after making huge concessions to the opponents of the treaty in terms of agreeing to fund a major new buildup in nuclear weapons. He was so disheartened by this is my reading at least of what happened, is he just gave up his effort to try to pursue that, and it just died a natural death. So I think in that case, it was the opposition. The main lesson I got from that is that President Obama had the right thinking, the right ideas, the willingness to do it, but he lacked public support. The public was not aware of the problem really and was not really behind him, and therefore the Congress was not willing to support him. Tom?
Yeah, if I could just add a couple of things to that, to the Obama experience, which I think are lessons for if we get a Biden administration. Obama really ran into a wall of Republican opposition, even to treaties that were quite moderate and reasonable, like the New START Treaty. So the Republican Party has essentially decided to oppose even the most reasonable arms control proposals. And that'll be a problem if a Biden administration comes in too. We also had a resurgent Russia. Russia decided to go into Crimea and be more expansionist, and that made it very difficult politically for Obama to do the second step. I mean, New START was always just a first step. He planned to go further. But then once Russia started behaving more badly, he had a much more difficult political road on that. And finally, when presidents take their eye off the ball, as President Obama did, as he moved on to other issues, the issues fall to their staff that they put in place. And Obama had some internal resistance. Not everybody in the Pentagon and other places bought into his vision. So when President Obama turned to different issues, the staff that was left to implement took it in a different way, which is how I think we wound up with this $2 trillion modernization program. The bureaucracy simply ran away with it. So the lessons for a possible Biden administration is start early with your priorities, choose your staff carefully, don't lose focus, and don't depend on the Russians to follow you every step. We should do what we feel we need to do for U.S. security.
Let me follow up on a couple of things that you said. There are obstacles, and there will probably always be obstacles, and you've pointed to some of them. And the staff are certainly important. What about the kind of the nuclear bureaucracy that you mentioned also as a major stumbling block? And I guess that includes the armed services, essentially the Pentagon, perhaps military contractors. How even if you have the best staff, I would imagine, and kept your eye on the ball, I would imagine there still would be problems even further down the line to implementing the vision that you might have or that Biden might have. Are there any things that can be done to reduce the inertia that the bureaucracy presents? Bill, do you have thoughts?
Let me comment first of all about the military aspect of that issue. Contrary to popular opinion, nuclear weapons are not all that popular in the military. And the time I was secretary, anytime I gave them a choice between spending money on nuclear weapons or spending on conventional weapons, they would invariably choose conventional weapons. Those are weapons they could use, would use, found important to use, where they believed that they were never going to be using rightly, they're never going to be using the nuclear weapons. So the military, except for that small part of the military that's actually involved in nuclear weapons, is not really a strong supporter of nuclear weapons, and therefore not a major obstacle to what we're talking about. Tom?
I agree with that. I think people tend to think of the bureaucracy as neutral, as implementing the policies of the president. The problem is that once the policies are set, and many of these policies were set decades ago, then the bureaucracy kind of grows around the policy and becomes the support for the status quo. And so any president coming in trying to change that default setting, if you will, it's very difficult. It becomes a political lift, and it's hard to do. And it can only happen, in our experience, with presidential leadership from above. The president has to decide that this is an important thing, and then pressure the bureaucracy to do it. And even so, without public support, as Bill said, it's hard to keep that pressure going. And so it's those two things. It's presidential leadership and public support that creates the political will for a presidency to change the bureaucratic process.
Let me add to that, Kenneth, on the public support point. The main reason that Tom and I wrote this book is we're trying to build up the public support. We're trying to educate the public on these issues so that public support will be there when the new president comes in and wants to use it, wants to actually do something. He'll need that support desperately. And we're hoping that by that time that through this book and through other means, we will be able to build up some of that public support. The president is not opposed to what we're talking about now. They don't understand that there's more of an apathy problem than an opposition problem.
I certainly agree with you, and it's one of the reasons that the Bulletin was founded, as you know, to help the citizens understand more about these issues. Can you speak to what citizens might be able to do? I mean, you talk about public support, and that's clearly true. And in the past, there have been times in the 1980s, the freeze movement was, people were out on the streets protesting and bringing pressure to bear. Are there particular things or ideas that you have about how people listening in on this call and elsewhere can help move this agenda forward?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
I had earlier, when I was teamed up with Schultz and Kissinger and Sam Nunn, was working to try to get citizens interested in eliminating nuclear weapons, giving up nuclear weapons altogether. And finally concluded that was a road too far too soon. We don't concentrate on big issues like that. We concentrate on single steps that can be taken to reduce the danger of nuclear weapons, given that you have them, to reduce the danger. Those individual issues are things the president can understand. One of them is, which Tom has already talked about some length, is the fact that only the president and the president alone can launch nuclear weapons. That's so-called presidential sole authority. That is the danger which we don't have to live with. That's a danger which is easy for people to understand. And so if we get support rally behind individual actions like that, that reduce the risk of nuclear weapons, then we've accomplished something. Tom?
Thanks. I want to call out the special role for scientists as well as the special role for citizens in general. I mean, we really are desperate right now for a fact-based policy. I mean, we see it every day, how politicians simply don't use facts. And science is the fact-based analysis that we need. But we see it's not sufficient. We need a policy process and a political process that demands facts and a fact-based discussion. And so we need to get back to that. And I think having scientific input is a huge piece of that. But in addition, we need citizens who are voting on these issues and who tell their members of Congress that they care about these issues. So we need the public and particularly the people on this call to tell their members of Congress that facts matter, that nuclear security matters, and that they will vote for a president who will reduce the danger of nuclear war.
Good. Thank you very much. I'd like to open it up to the participants here in this seminar. And I'd like to ask Hallie to remind us again about how to ask questions and how to engage in the conversation. Hallie?
Thank you. As a reminder, my name is Hallie Posner. I'm the program coordinator here at the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. And we do ask that you please keep yourself on mute throughout the program unless you are called on for a question. But please keep your cameras on as we are striving to build community, and all of you are indeed our community. So if you have a question for our speakers or moderator, please use the raise hand function. Our moderator will see that and call on you. You can find this by clicking on the participants button at the bottom of your screen. Please do not physically raise your hand, as there are too many participants for us to recognize you in that way. Also, please note that we have many folks on the call, so we apologize in advance if we do not get to your question. Except rest assured, we can see you if you use the raise your hand function. And a recording of this program will be on our website after it concludes. Back to you, Kenneth.
Great. Good. So we have several hands raised, and I have, it says in my participants list, we have about 180 people, I think, on this call. It's terrific. Let me start with Jonathan Rodriguez.
Hello. Thank you all very much for hosting this discussion. This is very illuminating, and thank you so much for the excellent book. One area I wanted to ask about, which is touched upon in the book, but maybe not at length, is the book brings up the concern about cyber attacks on nuclear weapons and several possibilities for what could happen there, including creating nuclear false alarms or even hijacking a weapon. And that sort of also makes me think of Secretary Perry, what you had said about how the Russians are not suicidal and they wouldn't take an action that's suicidal. I worry that there might be terrorists, either international or domestic terrorists, who are suicidal, and might be able to perpetrate a cyber attack with the intention of annihilating the world because they want maybe the glory of ending the world themselves or something like that. Is this an area that the administration is adequately thinking about? I mean, and are there protocols in place for if there is an incident between the US and Russia caused by a cyber attack false alarm, for how to defuse the situation?
Thank you. Bill?
I would say that certainly the administration and later administrations will understand the danger of cyber attack and have taken and will continue to take steps to minimize that danger. But there's no way of truly eliminating the danger. So in my judgment, the best thing to do, understanding that whatever we do to minimize the danger, there's a possibility of a cyber attack being successful. The main thing we can do is get away from quick launch policies. It's making the decision in a hurry, make the decision quickly, which makes us most susceptible to the cyber attack. So if we put a time to consider, to evaluate, to bring in experts to evaluate, then we reduce our vulnerability to cyber attack. So adding more time, getting away from quick launches, I think the best way of defending against that problem. Tom?
I agree completely. I would just add that in cyber, is whatever defenses we might put up against cyber attack, the offenses will always have the advantage. So we need to think of policy fixes to this, if you will. And as Bill just said, the most important policy fix is to give the president more time, because any alarm, any possible attack because of cyber could very well be a false alarm. So there should be no quick launches. The president should not be making decisions within minutes, because that decision could very well start nuclear war by mistake. So cyber, to me, and I didn't fully realize this when we started writing the book, but cyber to me has become one of the main justifications for getting out of sole authority, for getting out of first use, for getting out of weapons on high alert, and buying the president as much time as you possibly can.
I emphasize again, the single most important thing we can do to deal with that problem and other problems as well is to get away from quick launch.
I have about 10 questions now, so I will try and move through these as quickly as possible. Max Savashinsky.
Hello, thanks for putting on this great event today. I really appreciate it. It's a great pleasure to be here. My question is about marshaling public support for nuclear policy. And I wonder if any of the speakers can speak to your feelings about whether on the public side, whether the failure to move policy is a factor of a lack of numbers or a failure of sort of tactics. Obviously, if it's numbers, then we need more, and I think everybody here knows that we do. But in terms of tactics, I'm wondering whether you have any insights about, in terms of sort of mass movements and mobilizing people, whether there have been like notable failures or unseized opportunities to mobilize the public towards these goals that we've been talking about today.
That's a great question, Max. My own view on that is that it's very difficult, if maybe close to impossible, to really cause my generation to be rethinking this problem seriously. So I tend to focus my attention on the younger generation. I hope, and they are almost completely uninformed on this problem, so it's a fertile field. But they also, I think, have very open minds. And they can be convinced on this. We have, in my project, we have just released recently a podcast. And the first 4 terms of which are already out and is available to people to listen to today. And the focus of this podcast is to younger people. And in fact, the narrator for the podcast is my granddaughter, who's still in the late 20s. So we're trying to appeal to younger people because this is where I think the hope are of really educated people. Tom, what do you say?
I would just briefly add that, we have a mass movement. We have a huge mass movement taking force across the country right now, focused on racial injustice, but coming out of concerns about the economy, women's rights, and other things that were kind of born of the Trump presidency. And a lot of the things that people want to fix these issues, whether it be climate solutions, fixing racial injustice, fixing the economy, will take a lot of money. And interestingly, the nuclear weapons issue has a lot of money being invested in it, but it's being invested wrongly. So we actually have a lot of money to give away in the nuclear weapons space to these other issues. So what I would like to see is somehow nuclear weapons become part of the mass movement we see today, and be seen for what it is, a wasteful program that can be used at least as a down payment to many of these other things that we want to do.
Great, thank you. I'd like to turn now to a couple of people from outside the United States to get some views from them. And I have Max Schultz from Germany.
Hello, thank you very much. I was wondering, so independently of whether or not one believes in the theory of nuclear deterrence, my opinion is, or my impression is, that the military and politics do. So how would restricting the sole authority of the President of the United States on nuclear weapons, how would this restrict or influence the whole deterrence?
Good. Bill?
Would you answer?
Sure. I mean, I think our position on that would be that sole authority, quick launch, and first strikes are not necessary for deterrence. What you need for deterrence is an assured second strike retaliation, right? We need to make it clear to Russia that if you attack us, we will have the ability to respond. And they know that perfectly well, but that does not require us launching on quick notice. It doesn't require the president having sole authority. It doesn't require a first strike. Because even if the Russians attack the United States, a highly unlikely situation, and say wipe out all of our land-based ICBMs, which are highly vulnerable, we will still have hundreds of weapons deployed under the oceans on submarines or on bombers that might have escaped into the air before the attack arrived. And Russia knows that full well. So that is the basis, and that's the core of our deterrence, and we don't need a quick launch ability to achieve that.
Good. Thank you. And I have Fritz Pointer next on my list. You need to unmute.
Low tech. Yeah, Daniel Ellsberg points out that the Cold War was a massive marketing strategy for the aerospace industry. And just kind of dovetailing off of what Tom said about the funds and the funding money and where it is and how we can use that money. You know, this is a major, I think we're talking about defunding the police. We may talk about now defunding the Pentagon. I've seen a couple of mentions of that recently. Also, just one other thing, if you could comment on America withdrawing from the Open Skies Treaty recently, and also China's declining participating with America and the United States and Russia in this current nuclear disarmament talks.
Thank you.
Well, maybe Bill, I'll start on the money, and then you can talk about open skies. Just quickly on the money. I mean, there's plenty of examples of money that's now going towards new nuclear weapons programs that we think would be better spent elsewhere. And the primary example is the $100 billion program to rebuild our land-based ballistic missiles, the ICBMs. We think these weapons are dangerous. They increase the false alarm danger, and that money would be much better spent as a down payment towards all of the societal problems that we have today. So let's put our money into the highest priority issues and not waste them on nuclear weapons that make us less safe.
Now, first, it won't surprise you to know that I'm not really in favor of defunding the Pentagon. We do have national security problems, and our military is a part of the solution of those problems. What I'm in favor of is defunding the nuclear spending in the Pentagon. And there's, as Tom has pointed out, there's a huge piggy bank there of nuclear funding that could be used either for military applications that are more vital to the country, or more importantly, for some of the issues that have been raised by the pandemics and some of the issues that have to do with education. The list is long, but the funding we're spending on nuclear weapons today and the funding we're committed to spend in the future, which the last estimate I saw was the next 30 years, the program of record is going to have it spending $1.7 trillion. That's a lot of money. And we have many, many other useful needs for that. But one of the things that the pandemic has done is pointed out to us the importance of spending in other areas and the need that's been developed spending in other areas. As we have come out of the pandemic, hopefully soon, we're going to be in a very deep recession, maybe even a depression, economic depression. And therefore, there's going to be huge pressure to find where the source of that money is going to be. And quite obviously, the spending we have on nuclear weapons today would be an obvious source for that.
And would you like to briefly comment on the Open Skies Treaty withdrawal or other treaties, negotiations?
I don't think the Open Skies Treaty was that big a deal, to be honest with you. But it was a good treaty. It was the main thing that it did, I think. And the reason I didn't think it was so important is because we have satellites that really do most of the jobs of the Open Sky Treaty. And our satellites are very good. But the great thing about the Open Skies Treaty was the dialogue they created between the United States and Russia, the willingness of the two countries to allow each other to fly over. It created an environment and atmosphere which is very positive. And it was stupid. It was really stupid to terminate it.
Good, thank you. I'd like to turn now to John Hallam, who is in Australia, speaking to us at 3 a.m. in the morning. John?
Can you hear me? Yeah, look, obviously I've been extremely impressed by the quality of discussion here, and Tom Collina and Bill Perry are two of my idols, gurus, whatever you want to call it. I have been pursuing this issue of particularly de-alerting, but risk reduction over a broad spectrum for roughly the last 10 years, a bit more than that. Got myself a resolution in the UN General Assembly about it, the de-alerting resolution. I basically want to give an unashamed plug. Abolition 2000 is doing a somewhat similar webinar to this with a number of distinguished people on it, including Rachel. So I would commend that to you, and the URL is on your chat box.
Thank you.
Thanks for an absolutely terrific webinar.
Good. Thank you very much. Let's see, I think I'd like to turn to Sam Brown next. Are you there? Okay. You have to unmute if you'd like to speak.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. I'm very impressed with the persuasive arguments that the book makes for a no first use nuclear policy. But there is a set of problems that it doesn't appear to deal with, this no first use policy. The policy of no first use is backed up, according to your analysis, by the retention on our part of a retaliatory capability that would be sufficient to deter the first use by an enemy. But that retaliatory capability, resting as it does on nuclear weapons, a lot of nuclear weapons, many of them based on submarines, that policy of retaliation, if we ever have to use it, is also an indiscriminate policy, an indiscriminate nuclear policy that is in violation of the rules of war, that goes counter to just war prohibitions on the killing of civilians and non-combatants. How do we justifiably maintain that kind of a response to the nuclear attack, which we obviously regard as illegitimate? Don't we run into the problem of legitimizing, through our second strike retaliation, nuclear attacks themselves?
Thank you very much. Tom, would you like to start?
Sure. I mean, I guess my answer would be to agree with what you're saying about the indiscriminate and horrific nature of even a nuclear retaliation. And so I would hope that once all nations agree that the only purpose of nuclear weapons is to use them in retaliation, then the question becomes, why do we have them at all? If we just have them to deter each other and no one's going to use them first, then they're essentially unusable. And I think that's de facto where we are today, but it just hasn't been formalized. So once we have a global no first use policy, essentially no one is going to use them, then we should get serious about elimination, which is where I think we ultimately need to go, but it's going to take time.
Bill, would you like to add anything?
Yes, which is some years ago, Schultz and Kissinger and I formed together to try to get an agreement to eliminate all nuclear weapons. That was the goal, and that's still my goal. And that was a bridge too far, as it turned out. We made very little headway in trying to move that idea. But rather than give up altogether, we've retreated the idea, well, if we cannot eliminate them yet, in the meantime, let's do everything we can to reduce the dangers. That's what our book is focused on, how do you reduce the dangers? But no way do I back away from my notion that the ultimate goal is the full elimination of nuclear weapons. So I tend to agree with what a speaker, what a questioner has said.
Thank you. I have Mary Jane Williams next.
I have been doing this for 40 years, probably a lot of you even longer, I don't know, some of you anyway. In the 1980s, I was very involved in the nuclear freeze and all of that. And it's so disappointing that 40 years later, we're still here, it's still talking about it. okay, all those thousands of people, a lot of them women, frankly, who heard Dr. Helen Caldicott talk, those people started picking up other issues and they let the nuclear issue drop. And then we had Obama who did the same darn thing. I don't think anybody's going to be talking about citizens now. I don't think they're going to be excited about just, you know, one issue, 2 issues, or 14 things, however many things. What we have to do is get people afraid again, frankly. And so the question is, how do we do this? So we've got all these young people marching through the streets. Why? Because they have an emotional feeling about something. So I think we have to do this again, and ideally get the same people understanding that the very most important issue is nuclear stuff. So anyway, my own contribution is one of them. I've written a couple of plays. Here it is, Adam and Eve. We could, at the end of this play, this is about a young woman who takes part in 1981, as I did, marching and you know, trying to get Reagan to abolish nuclear weapons, etc. Anyway, at the very end of this play, she actually comes forward to the stage and says, all right, you know, everyone who's been convinced by these talking, go and sign up at our table. In other words, this would be an organizing tool. And back in the 80s, if people remember, we had people like Dr. Helen Caldicott and others going on college campuses from one to the other, giving speeches. And that's how we got the college kids involved and everybody else. So I think we got to do that again.
Thank you very much. Tom, do you want to comment?
Sure, I think the questioner is exactly right. I think the way to do that is probably not to create a separate movement, but to bring the bomb into the current mass movement, right? I mean, we have so many people so active today, a larger mass movement than certainly I've ever seen in my lifetime. But it doesn't really include nuclear policy. It doesn't include disarmament. So how do we bring nuclear policy into that? And I think groups like Plowshares are trying to do that, trying to make connections with the leaders of the new mass movement. And I think the way we can make that work is to show all the resources that are available here that will need, that the other movements will need. And therefore that nuclear policy and reducing nuclear spending can help the other areas.
Good.
The young people simply are not aware of this issue today in general. And our purpose is to make them aware of it. That's what our book is about. That's what our talks are about, is trying, and it's focused mostly at young people to make them, once they become aware of it, and they're quite capable of understanding it, once they become aware of it, then it will become part of this mass movement, as Tom says.
Yeah, I think that's right. Certainly when I teach, that seems to be what happens. I'd like to turn to Toshiya Umehara in Japan. Thank you for your patience.
Hello. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Right. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, two of you. It's been very inspiring to hear what you're thinking, especially thinking it's the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. My question is about the usability and tactical nuclear weapons. I gather that the Russians have this unofficial doctrine of escalate to de-escalate, and then also there are some in the United States who said that they need some more new types of tactical nuclear weapons to deter or deny that capability. And I also know that there's already a new type of low-yield nuclear warhead deployed to submarines. So I'm interested in what you're thinking about this latest development. Thank you.
The attractive feature of tactical nuclear weapons is they're more usable. And that's also the reason, we're so strongly opposed to them. We don't want them to be more usable. We don't want any nuclear weapons to be usable. the best thing you can do about it, as long as we have nuclear weapons, is be sure they're not used. And to be sure, a tactical nuclear weapon, we tend to think that's something that's small and relatively insignificant. All the tactical nuclear weapons I know about have destructive powers of many hundreds of times the power of the largest conventional bomb we have. So it's a misnomer almost to call them tactical.
So I'm going to turn now to Jeannie Donahue.
Yes, thank you. I'm calling from the Veterans Association or Veterans Administration, where ironically my husband is receiving radiation therapy as we speak. And it's back on because it's supposed to be. My question is, and my comment is about the, I think it's the year anniversary of when the Russians had their super secret deep sea submarine nuclear catastrophe where they had a fire in their nuclear compartment where they had the bombs. And of course the submariners were probably locked in there. They were regarded as heroes, but the commander of the Russian, some commander was able to squeak out before he was shut down. He said that these 14 submariners saved the world from complete, utter devastation. And that was 1 year ago. Would anybody like to make a comment on that?
Bill, Tom?
Sorry, just not familiar with it.
All right. We have time for one more question, I think. Is that right, Rachel? I'm keeping an eye on the clock.
Yeah, I think we're probably right at 1 o'clock.
Okay, well, let me just turn to Alan Robach for a final question, and then we will have to bring this to a close. Alan?
Hi, I was just wondering if warning people about the climatic effects of nuclear war, that if we even use our weapons as a deterrence, we'll kill ourselves by getting rid of our food supply, would be more effective, or going back to the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and trying to push that as the world's view of what to do about nuclear weapons. Which of those arguments are more important to make, and how can we make them?
Very good, about citizens' knowledge. Tom, do you want to start?
Sure, I think they're all important. I don't like to draw, priorities or competition between issues, but I think certainly the issue of nuclear and climate are tremendously important issues to link to climate issues, nuclear winter and all the rest. Certainly the issue of, even if we use nuclear weapons to decimate Russia and Russia never responds, we've probably cooked our goose regardless, are all important issues to make. And particularly internationally, it doesn't play so well here in the United States, unfortunately, but internationally, talking about the ban treaty is I think, very effective. And symbolically, we want to make it clear to the United States and the other nuclear weapons possessors that they're working against history, right? I mean, the arc of history is bending towards the elimination of nuclear weapons, just as it did towards the elimination of chemical weapons and biological weapons. We are seeking to eliminate weapons of mass destruction. Nuclear weapons are next, and countries need to get ready for it.
Bill, do you have a final word for us before we close?
Tom said it just right, and I just want to thank the Bulletin for sponsoring this very illuminating discussion, been drawing out such a large crowd. And I just think it's been a very fascinating discussion, and I thank you all for it.
Thank you for your book.
Yes, thank you for the book, and thank you for taking time to meet with us today. And thank you to all the participants. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all your questions, but just shows the robust nature of this discussion. We'll just have to do it again. Thank you, Rachel, on the Bulletin, for hosting this, and stay safe and stay sane.